There's a moment, and if you've lived past 40, you've had it, where everything goes quiet and instead of feeling relief, you feel something closer to alarm, not the alarm of danger. Something stranger than that, the alarm of recognition. Like something in the room just turned to look at you, and the room was empty. Most people reach for their phone at that moment, or turn on a podcast, or manufacture some small urgency that fills the space before the space can fill them. And we don't usually stop to ask why we do that. We call it habit, restlessness, modern life. We give it a name that doesn't cost us anything, and we move on. But what if that instinct, that specific, almost involuntary reach away from silence, isn't avoidance at all? What if it's accurate? What if some part of you already knows below the level of reasoning that silence isn't neutral, that it isn't simply the absence of sound, that it is in fact a presence, measurable, structured, and in some way that serious science is only beginning to articulate, fundamentally entangled with the thing you call your awareness? That's not a metaphor. That's the problem. Here is what nobody tells you about silence. It has been one of the most contested territories in the history of human thought, not because thinkers disagreed about its value, but because they couldn't agree on what it was. Mystics said it was where God lived. Physicists said it was where energy approached zero. Neuroscientists said it was what the brain produced when input dropped below threshold. Three entirely different objects, all called by the same name, and consciousness, the felt sense of being here, of being someone who is having this moment, not just processing it, sits uncomfortably at the intersection of all three definitions, belonging fully to none of them. That's not a philosophical puzzle reserved for academics. That's your Wednesday afternoon when the house is finally empty and you don't quite know what to do with yourself. So here is the question this video is actually asking, and I'm not going to answer it in the first 3 minutes because it doesn't deserve a quick answer. What if the quietest moment of your life was also the loudest thing that ever happened to you? Not loud in the sense of noise, loud in the sense of signal. In the sense that everything you've been trying to hear through the decades, through the productivity and the conversations and the careful construction of a life that makes sense, was broadcasting clearly the entire time. And silence isn't the place you go to rest from the signal. Silence is where you finally become capable of receiving it. That's the claim. And before this video is over, you'll either understand why that claim is grounded in some of the most serious physics and neuroscience of the last 50 years, or you'll understand exactly why it can't be, which is equally useful. Either way, something will have shifted. One thing before we go further. This is not a video about meditation. It will not ask you to sit cross-legged, regulate your breathing, or adopt any practice whatsoever. If you came for that, you'll find it elsewhere, and that's fine. What this video is about is something more uncomfortable, and I'd argue more honest. The possibility that silence is not a technique. It's a measurement instrument, and what it measures, we'll get to that. But not yet, because before we can understand what silence measures, we have to understand why Western science spent 400 years convinced that silence measured nothing at all, and why that conviction, however reasonable it seemed, left us with a hole in the center of our understanding of consciousness so large that the most brilliant minds in physics and neurology are still, right now, falling into it. That's where we start. Here's where the problem starts. And it starts, like most deep problems, with a decision that seemed entirely reasonable at the time. When Western science formalized its methods in the 17th century, Descartes, Bacon, Newton, it made a foundational choice that would shape the next 400 years of human self-understanding. It decided that the real world was the world of measurable signals. Force, mass, velocity, light, heat. What could be quantified could be known. What could be known could be controlled. And what couldn't be measured would eventually either yield to better instruments or be quietly reclassified as not quite real. Silence in that framework was simply the floor. Zero signal. Baseline. The number you subtracted from the reading to get the actual reading. Silence wasn't a thing. It was the absence of things. A container, not a content. Background, not foreground. The space between the notes that the music theorists insisted on calling significant, but that serious scientists could afford to ignore. And consciousness? Consciousness was supposed to follow the same logic. The brain generates signals, electrical, chemical, measurable, and consciousness is what those signals produce, the way heat is what friction produces. Find the signals, map the patterns, build the model, and consciousness would eventually be explained. Fully, cleanly, without remainder. That was the plan. It didn't work. Not because the neuroscience was bad, the neuroscience was extraordinary. We mapped the brain with instruments our grandparents couldn't have imagined. We identified the regions that activate during fear, during love, during mathematical reasoning and moral deliberation. We traced the chemical pathways of grief and desire. We built a detailed, astonishing portrait of the brain in action, region by region, synapse by synapse, millisecond by millisecond. And at the end of all of it, the most honest researchers in the field were left holding a question nobody had managed to dissolve. Why does any of this feel like anything? Why isn't the brain just processing information in the dark, the way a calculator does, competently, efficiently, and with nobody home? Why does the electrochemical firing of neurons in your visual cortex produce the specific, irreducible experience of seeing red, rather than simply registering a wavelength of approximately 700 nanometers and adjusting behavior accordingly? The philosopher David Chalmers named this formally in 1995. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, and the name stuck not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. The easy problems of consciousness, how the brain integrates information, regulates attention, distinguishes self from environment, those are hard in the ordinary scientific sense. They require work, precision, decades of careful research. But they're solvable in principle. You build better instruments, map more connections, close the gap incrementally. The hard problem is different in kind, not degree. It asks why there is subjective experience at all, why there is something it is like to be you, sitting wherever you are right now, reading or listening to these words, feeling whatever you feel about them. That quality, the felt texture of experience, has a technical name in philosophy of mind, qualia, pronounced quadualia. A quale is what redness looks like from the inside, what coffee smells like before you've decided whether you like it, what loneliness weighs at 2 in the morning, not the processing of those inputs, the experience of them. No signal map has ever touched it. Now here's where silence enters the problem, and this is the first real crack in the conventional model. When researchers began studying the brain not during activity, but during the spaces between activity, not during signal, but during what you might call the brain's functional silence, they found something that flatly refused to fit. The brain at rest isn't quiet. It's doing something specific. There is a network neuroscientists call the default mode network, the DMN. It activates not when you're focused on a task, but precisely when you're not, when you're staring out a window, when you're sitting in between thoughts, when the external signal drops and something interior takes over. For years, researchers assumed this network was noise, the brain idling, burning metabolic fuel while waiting for the next real task to arrive. They called it the resting state and essentially filed it under irrelevant. Then the data started suggesting something they hadn't expected. The default mode network appears to be involved in self-referential processing. In the construction of autobiographical memory, the ongoing narrative that allows you to experience yourself as the same person who existed 20 years ago and will exist in some form 20 years from now. In the simulation of future events, in the integration of past ones, in what some researchers cautiously, carefully describe as the maintenance of the sense of self. In other words, the brain's version of silence, that apparently purposeless resting state, may be where the self is being continuously assembled, not where the self rests from work, where the self is the work. That's the hinge. Hold it. Because what this implies is that the Western model had the architecture exactly backwards. It treated signal as primary and silence as the baseline you subtract to get the real reading. But the neuroscience of the resting brain suggests that the silence, the gap, the space between activations, may be carrying structural information that the signal alone cannot account for, not absence. Architecture. And if that's true for the brain, if silence isn't zero but is instead a specific kind of organization, then the question of consciousness changes shape entirely. You're no longer asking what generates the signal. You're asking what shapes the silence between signals. And that question leads somewhere the neuroscientists, working alone, were not equipped to go. It leads into physics, into a domain where silence had been studied seriously, rigorously, and with results that almost nobody in the mainstream conversation about consciousness had properly absorbed. It leads specifically into quantum mechanics. And what quantum mechanics accidentally discovered about stillness, that's where this gets genuinely strange. Let's go back further than the neuroscience. Further back than Descartes, all the way back to a man who believed that the universe was, at its foundation, mathematical, and that mathematics was not invented by human minds, but heard by them. Pythagoras. Most people remember him for a theorem about triangles. But the theorem was almost incidental to what Pythagoras actually believed, which was this, that reality is organized by ratio and proportion, that harmony, harmonia, in Greek, meaning the fitting together of parts into a whole, is not a metaphor for beauty, but a structural description of how things cohere. And that silence was not the absence of harmony. Silence was the ground from which harmony became audible. He called it musica universalis, the music of the spheres. The idea that the planets in their orbits, the ratios of their distances, the timing of their movements, produced a kind of cosmic resonance that human ears could not detect, but that the trained mind could, in moments of sufficient stillness, directly perceive. We tend to dismiss this as pre-scientific poetry, as the charming speculation of a man who didn't yet have access to proper instruments. That may be a mistake. Because here is what Pythagoras was pointing toward, in the only language available to him in the 6th century BC, that reality has a structural dimension that is not carried by ordinary sensory signal, that there is an organizing layer beneath the noise of appearances, and that the human capacity to access that layer requires a specific condition, not effort, not accumulation of data, stillness. 25 centuries later, a physicist named David Bohm would arrive at a structurally identical conclusion from an entirely different direction, through the mathematics of quantum field theory, through years of dissatisfaction with explanations that predicted correctly, but explained nothing, and through a series of conversations with a man named Jiddu Krishnamurti that his colleagues found deeply suspicious and that he found apparently indispensable. Bohm was one of the most original thinkers in 20th century physics, a colleague of Einstein's, a man who spent his career dissatisfied with the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, not because it was wrong in its predictions were and remain the most precisely verified in the history of science, but because he believed it was catastrophically incomplete in its explanation. Quantum mechanics works, but it works in a way that, if you look at it with genuine honesty, makes very little intuitive sense. Particles exist in superposition, meaning they occupy multiple states simultaneously until the moment they are measured, at which point they appear to collapse into a single definite state. Entangled particles influence each other instantaneously across arbitrary distances so vast that no signal traveling at the speed of light could account for the correlation. The act of observation changes the thing observed, not as a philosophical nicety, but as a measurable, reproducible, experimental fact. And beneath all of this, there is what physicists call the quantum vacuum, not empty space, not silence in the ordinary sense, but a seething, structured field of potential energy that fluctuates even at absolute zero temperature, never fully settling, never fully still. The vacuum is not nothing. It is the most energetically dense thing we have ever attempted to measure, and our measurements have consistently underestimated it. Bohm looked at all of this and proposed something radical. He called it the implicate order, the enfolded order. The idea that what we observe as separate, localized, signal-carrying objects are not the fundamental layer of reality. They are explicate, unfolded, visible, measurable, the surface of a much deeper structure. Beneath them, enfolded into the quantum vacuum itself, is an order where everything is already connected, where the separations we perceive are provisional and surface level, where what looks like silence from the outside is at depth an almost incomprehensible density of structured relationship, not absence, infrastructure. This is the first peek of this video. Stay with it, because Bohm's implicate order isn't mysticism wearing a physics costume. It's a serious, mathematically grounded attempt to solve a genuine problem in quantum theory, the problem of non-locality. The experimentally verified, repeatedly confirmed fact that quantum systems remain correlated across space in ways that cannot be explained by any signal traveling between them. Something connects them that is not a signal, something that, from the perspective of signal-based science, looks exactly like silence, but behaves like information. Bohm proposed that consciousness itself might be an expression of this implicate order, not generated by the brain the way heat is generated by friction, but disclosed by the brain the way a lens discloses light that was already traveling through the room before the lens arrived. The brain, in this view, is not the origin of awareness. It is a receiving and organizing structure. And silence, genuine, unmanufactured silence, might be the condition under which that structure stops amplifying its own internal noise long enough to register what was always present. Not the brain creating consciousness, the brain tuning into it. Now move forward 40 years, and the physics becomes even more anatomically specific. In the 1990s, mathematician and physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff proposed what they called orchestrated objective reduction, OR for short. It is, depending on who you ask, either the most serious scientific attempt to ground consciousness in quantum physics, or the most elaborately constructed wrong turn in the history of consciousness studies. The debate is ongoing and genuinely unresolved. What matters for this conversation is what the theory actually claims, because the claim is remarkable. Penrose had argued in his books The Emperor's New Mind and Shadows of the Mind that human consciousness involves a kind of computation that cannot be replicated by classical algorithms, that there is something happening in awareness that goes beyond what any conventional computational system, however powerful, could reproduce. He located this something in quantum processes. Specifically, he proposed that the collapse of quantum superposition, that moment when a particle stops being in multiple states simultaneously and becomes one definite thing, is not a random event. It is, he argued, a moment of objective reduction, a structural event in the geometry of space-time itself, governed by what he called quantum gravity. Hameroff brought the biology. He proposed that the specific structures inside neurons where this quantum collapse might occur are microtubules, cylindrical protein structures that form part of the internal skeleton of cells, including neurons. Microtubules are extraordinarily small, extraordinarily well organized, and Hameroff argued structurally capable of sustaining quantum coherence, meaning quantum superposition, long enough for it to be computationally relevant to neural processing. Quantum coherence, translated plainly, means this: a system maintaining multiple possible states simultaneously without collapsing into any one of them, holding the question open, in a sense, before committing to an answer. And here is the detail that stops you cold if you follow it to its implication. Quantum coherence is extraordinarily fragile. It is destroyed by interaction with the environment, by thermal noise, by vibration, by signal. The warmer and noisier the system, the faster coherence collapses and the quantum information is lost. For decades, one of the standard objections to OR was precisely this: the brain is too warm, too wet, too noisy an environment for quantum coherence to survive long enough to do anything meaningful. But recent experimental work has complicated that objection significantly. In 2007, researchers studying photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert light into energy, discovered quantum coherence operating in biological systems at room temperature, persisting far longer than the standard model predicted it should. In 2014, further evidence suggested that certain birds navigate using quantum entanglement in their retinal cells, maintaining coherent quantum states in warm biological tissue during actual, functioning biological processes. The brain may be noisier than a laboratory vacuum, but biology, it turns out, has found ways to sustain quantum order inside organic systems that classical physics said couldn't support it, which means the objection isn't closed, which means OR remains a serious, contested, unresolved proposal, not fringe speculation, but a legitimate scientific hypothesis held open by some of the most rigorous minds working at the intersection of physics and neuroscience. And here is what that proposal implies about silence. If Hameroff and Penrose are even partially correct, if quantum processes in microtubules play any role in the generation or organization of conscious experience, then silence is not merely the subjective feeling of quietness, it is a physical condition that changes the operating environment of the structures potentially responsible for consciousness itself. Reduced external signal means reduced thermal noise. Reduced thermal noise means longer coherence times. Longer coherence times means more quantum information preserved before collapse. More quantum information preserved means, if the theory holds, richer, more integrated moments of conscious experience. Not silence as rest. Silence as optimal operating condition. This is the point where the mystical traditions and the quantum biology are, for the first time in history, describing the same phenomenon in different vocabularies. The contemplative who said that stillness reveals what noise conceals was not speaking poetically about subjective comfort. They may have been making a precise, if intuitive, observation about the physics of awareness. Pythagoras listening for the music of the spheres. Bohm enfolding consciousness into the quantum vacuum. Penrose and Hameroff locating the seat of experience in structures that require stillness to function at their deepest level. 3 different centuries. 3 different methods. 1 convergence. But here is where the mini payoff becomes a new problem, and this is the hinge that connects the physics to you specifically. Knowing that silence has a structural role in consciousness doesn't tell you what to do with the silence you've been avoiding. It doesn't explain why, after a lifetime of building, achieving, maintaining, and providing, the quiet feels less like relief and more like exposure. It doesn't account for the specific texture of discomfort that arrives, not when life is falling apart, but precisely when it isn't, when everything is, by any reasonable measure, fine, and you don't know what to do with fine. That's not a physics problem. That's a personal one, and it requires a different kind of investigation entirely. Let's slow down for a moment and talk about what's actually happening in your life. Not in a general, anyone could be watching sense. Specifically, you've probably noticed, and if you haven't consciously noticed, you've felt it, that silence hits differently now than it did 20 years ago, when you were building your career, raising children, managing the 10,000 logistics of a life in full motion. Silence was a luxury you didn't have. You wanted it. You fantasized about it. A weekend alone, a morning without anyone needing anything, a stretch of unscheduled time that belonged to you completely. And then at some point you got some version of that, and it wasn't what you expected. This is not a complaint about ingratitude. It's an observation about architecture. The life you built, the relationships, the routines, the roles, the identity that accumulated around you like sediment around a riverbed, was also functioning as a very sophisticated noise generation system. Not deliberately, not pathologically, just structurally. Every role you inhabited produced signal. Parent, provider, professional, partner, problem solver. Each one came with its own frequency, its own set of demands that told you continuously who you were by telling you what you were needed for. That's not a criticism of those roles. That's just how identity works when it's externally anchored. The signal was the self, or at least it felt that way for long enough that the distinction stopped mattering. And then the signal began to shift. Children grew, careers peaked or pivoted, relationships settled into a different register. The acute emergencies of midlife gave way to something slower and harder to name. And suddenly, the silence that arrived in the gaps wasn't peaceful. It was diagnostic. Here's the thing about a diagnostic silence. It doesn't tell you that something is wrong. It tells you that something is present, that the noise was covering. And those are not the same thing, even though they feel identical from the inside. When you sit in genuine quiet, not the managed quiet of a spa or a meditation app, but the unstructured quiet of an ordinary afternoon with no agenda, what arrives is not nothing. What arrives is a quality of attention that has nowhere external to go, and so it turns. Inward isn't quite the right word, because inward implies a direction, and this doesn't feel directional. It feels more like a pressure equalizing, like the moment after a long flight when your ears finally clear and you realize how muffled everything had been. You weren't aware of the muffling while it was happening. That's the mechanism. But here's what makes this specific to where you are in life and not just a general human observation. By the time you reach your mid-40s and beyond, you have accumulated something that younger people genuinely do not have, a long enough track record of your own patterns to recognize them. You have watched yourself make certain kinds of decisions repeatedly. You have seen which fears reliably disguise themselves as reasonable caution. You have noticed, if you've been paying any attention at all, that the story you tell about yourself has certain fixed points that you navigate around without ever examining directly. The silence threatens those fixed points, not because it reveals that they're false. It's more subtle than that. It reveals that they're choices. That the version of yourself you've been maintaining, the particular shape your life has taken, is not the inevitable result of your circumstances, but a continuous, ongoing act of authorship that you've been performing so fluently for so long that it stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like fact. Silence interrupts the performance, not to destroy it, to make it visible. And this is precisely where most people in your position make a move that is completely understandable and almost entirely counterproductive. They treat the discomfort of that visibility as a sign that something has gone wrong, that the silence is surfacing damage, old grief, unresolved conflict, accumulated regret, and that the appropriate response is either to process it therapeutically or to fill it back up with activity until the feeling passes. Both responses miss the point, not because therapy is wrong or activity is wrong, but because both responses treat the discomfort as a problem to be solved rather than as information to be received. They reach for a tool when what the moment requires is receptivity. This is the difference, and it is a real difference, between using silence and being in it. Using silence is a technique. You deploy it, you extract value from it, you measure the result, you decide whether it was worth the investment. This is the self-optimization version of stillness, and it has its place. It reduces cortisol. It improves sleep. It supports the default mode network processing we discussed earlier. These are real, documented, useful effects, but they are not what we're talking about. Being in silence is something else. It's closer to what happens when you stop trying to get something from an experience and simply allow the experience to be what it is. It sounds passive. It is, in fact, one of the most demanding things a human being can do, particularly a human being who has spent decades being effective, productive, and relied upon. Particularly someone for whom competence is not just a skill, but a core component of identity. Because competence is a form of signal generation, and silence asks you to stop generating. Here's the paradox that lives inside that ask, and it's worth naming clearly because most conversations about silence skip past it entirely. The disruption you feel in genuine silence is not a side effect of the process, it is the process. When the external signal drops and the internal noise becomes audible, the low-grade, unresolved hum of questions you've been too busy to sit with, the faint dissonance between the life you're living and the life you sense, somewhere beneath articulation that you're capable of. That discomfort is not evidence that silence is failing you. It's evidence that it's working, not X but Y. Not a sign that something is broken, but a sign that something is finally being measured. And here is the harder truth inside that truth. It tends to get louder before it gets quieter. The first layer of silence for most people at this stage of life is not peaceful at all. It's a cacophony of previously suppressed signal, concerns that were always there but never had airtime, feelings that were efficiently routed around, questions about meaning and direction and identity that the structure of a busy life rendered safely theoretical. They become less theoretical in the quiet. This is not pathology. This is the system working as designed. But, and this is the hinge that opens the next movement of this argument, understanding why the disruption happens doesn't make it easier to stay with. Knowing that turbulence is part of the descent doesn't make the descent comfortable. And there's a deeper reason for that, one that goes beyond psychology, beyond habit, beyond the accumulated momentum of a busy life. It goes back to physics, because what happens in sustained silence isn't just psychological reorganization. There's a structural parallel, a genuinely strange one, between what silence does to conscious experience and what measurement does in quantum mechanics. And that parallel, once you see it, changes the way you understand not just silence, but the nature of what you're calling yourself. That's where we're going next. In quantum mechanics, There is a principle called the observer effect, and it is almost universally misunderstood, including by people who invoke it constantly. The popular version goes like this: the act of observing something changes it, which means that consciousness somehow affects physical reality, which means that your thoughts shape the universe, which means, and this is where it usually ends up, that you can manifest a better parking spot if you believe hard enough. That is not what the observer effect says. What it actually says is both stranger and more useful. In quantum mechanics, a system exists in superposition, in multiple possible states simultaneously, until it interacts with its environment in a way that forces it to resolve into a single definite state. This resolution is called wave function collapse, meaning the spread of probabilities collapses into one actuality. The word observer in this context doesn't mean a conscious mind watching. It means any physical interaction that extracts information from the system. A photon hitting a detector, a particle interacting with a measuring apparatus, the environment itself through a process called decoherence, the tendency of quantum systems to lose their superposition by becoming entangled with surrounding matter, constantly performing measurement on everything around it. The environment is always observing, always collapsing, always forcing resolution, and here is where the parallel to your inner life becomes not a metaphor, but a structural description. The noise of your daily life, the continuous stream of demands, roles, obligations, social feedback, internal commentary, functions at the level of conscious experience, exactly the way environmental decoherence functions at the quantum level. It is a constant stream of measurement. Every interaction tells you who you are. Every role confirms a particular version of yourself. Every obligation resolves the question of what you should be doing right now into a single, definite answer. The noise is always observing you, and as long as it is, you remain in a collapsed state, one definite version of yourself, resolved, localized, specific. Functional, effective, recognizable, but not necessarily complete. Superposition, the quantum state of holding multiple possibilities simultaneously without resolving into any one of them, is not a state of confusion. It is a state of maximum potential. It is, in the language of information theory, the state of highest information content. A system in superposition contains more information than a system that has already collapsed into a single outcome, precisely because it retains the full range of what it could become. Collapse is necessary for function, but collapse is not the whole story. Now here is the second peak of this video, and I want you to follow this carefully because it's the point where the physics and the personal converge into something you can actually use. Not as a technique, but as a reorientation. When you enter genuine silence, not managed stillness, not the performance of calm, but the real thing, the kind that arrives when you stop feeding the measurement apparatus, something happens that is structurally parallel to what happens when a quantum system is isolated from its environment. The continuous collapse stops. The fixed, resolved, definite version of yourself that the noise was continuously confirming begins to lose its sharp edges, not because it was false, but because it was always a partial resolution of something larger. The roles, the identity, the story, they were real, they are real, but they were also the result of continuous environmental measurement, forcing you into a specific, localized, manageable shape. Silence suspends that measurement, and in the suspension, something that was always present but perpetually collapsed back into the background becomes briefly, uncomfortably, unmistakably available. Call it the unresolved self. Call it the field of what you still could be. Call it, if you want the quantum vocabulary, the superposition state of a consciousness that has been for decades continuously observed into a single identity and is now, for the first time in a long time, being left alone long enough to remember that it was never only that. This is what the alarm you felt was registering, not danger, expansion. The contemplative traditions knew this, each in their own vocabulary. The Buddhist concept of anatta, non-self, meaning the teaching that what you call yourself is not a fixed entity, but a continuous process, a river rather than a stone, maps onto this with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The self is not a thing. It is a pattern of collapse, a habitual resolution of an underlying field of potential into a specific recognizable form. Silence doesn't destroy that form. It reveals it as a form, which is different. The Christian contemplative tradition spoke of kenosis, self-emptying, the deliberate release of the constructed self to make room for something it called divine presence. The Taoist conception of wu-wei, non-doing, acting from the ground of stillness rather than from the momentum of habit, describes a mode of engagement with life that is only possible once you've stopped mistaking the noise for the source. 3 traditions, 3 geographies, 3 centuries of accumulated human experience pointing at the same structural observation. The self you know is the collapsed version. Silence is where the superposition lives, and here is where the argument lands with its full weight, because this is not just philosophy, and it is not just physics, and it is not just ancient wisdom speaking in poetic terms about something ineffable. This is about the specific, practical, irreversible fact of being at the stage of life you're at. By your mid-40s and beyond, you have done enough collapsing. You have resolved yourself into a definite shape often enough, consistently enough, that the shape is no longer in question. Other people know who you are. You know who you are. The identity is established, functional, and in many ways genuinely good. The product of real choices, real commitments, real love, and real work. But there is a cost to that much resolution. And the cost is this. The longer a quantum system is continuously observed into a single state, the harder it becomes to remember that the state was ever a choice rather than a necessity. The more completely you identify with the collapsed version of yourself, the roles, the story, the accumulated identity, the more the unresolved field beneath it feels not like potential, but like threat. The silence feels threatening, not because it brings bad news. It feels threatening because it brings news at all. But here is what changes when you understand the mechanism rather than just experiencing the discomfort. When you know that the alarm you feel in silence is the sensation of decoherence slowing, of the continuous environmental measurement losing its grip, of the superposition state beginning to re-emerge from beneath the collapsed identity, you have a choice that you didn't have before. Not the choice to feel differently. Feelings aren't decisions, the choice to interpret differently, to recognize the discomfort not as evidence that something is wrong with you, or with the silence, or with the life you've built, but as the specific sensation of a system regaining range. The way a joint that has been held in one position for too long aches when it finally moves. The ache is not damage. The ache is mobility returning. This is the reframe that changes everything. Not because it makes silence comfortable, but because it makes the discomfort legible. And legible discomfort is endurable in a way that mysterious discomfort simply isn't. You're not falling apart in the quiet. You're coming back into range, and yet, and this is the hinge, the place where this block hands off to the next movement, understanding the mechanism still leaves one question untouched. A question that is quieter than the others, less dramatic, and for that reason more persistent. It's not the question of what silence does to consciousness. We've covered that. It's not the question of why the discomfort arrives. We've covered that too. The question that remains is simpler and more personal. It's the question of who exactly is doing the observing. When the noise stops and the collapsed identity softens at its edges, and the superposition state begins to re-emerge, what is the thing that notices that happening? What is the awareness that watches the self become less certain of itself? It can't be the self, because the self is what's changing. Something is watching the watcher dissolve. That question has no easy answer, but it has a direction, and that direction is where we're going now. I want to step out of the argument for a moment. Not because the argument is finished, it isn't, but because there's something more important than the argument right now, which is the person watching it. And I have a sense, based on everything this video has been building toward, of who that person is. Not demographically, not by age or income or the particular configuration of their life circumstances, but by internal state. You are someone who has done the work. Not perfectly. Nobody does it perfectly, but seriously. You've taken your responsibilities seriously. You've shown up for the people who needed you. You've built something real, a family, a career, a body of knowledge, a set of relationships that have lasted long enough to become genuinely meaningful. You've navigated loss. You've recovered from things you weren't sure you'd recover from. You've arrived at a point in life that, by any external measure, represents success, or at least solidity. And you still feel somewhere beneath all of that a low-frequency sense of incompletion. Not dissatisfaction exactly, not ingratitude. Something more like the feeling that there's a question you haven't quite asked yet. A room in the house you've built that you've always known was there but have never walked into. Not because you were afraid of what you'd find, or not only because of that, but because the life you were living didn't leave you the kind of stillness required to locate the door. That's who this video is for. Not for people who are falling apart and looking for reassurance. Not for people who are beginning their journey into self-inquiry and need a map. For people who have already traveled a very long way, who are competent navigators, who know the terrain of their own psychology reasonably well, and who have arrived through no fault and no failure at a place where the old maps don't quite cover the new territory. The silence is the new territory. And it isn't asking you to become someone different. It isn't asking you to dismantle what you've built or reevaluate everything you've chosen or adopt a new identity that replaces the old one. It's asking something at once simpler and more demanding than any of those things. It's asking you to stay, not to analyze, not to optimize, not to extract value from the stillness and apply it strategically to the next phase of your development, just to remain present in the unmeasured space long enough for the thing that's always been broadcasting to finally find you listening. Which brings us to the question I mentioned, the one that has been quietly open since the beginning of this video, the one that all the physics and the neuroscience and the contemplative tradition have been circling without quite landing on. Not what silence does to you, but what you discover you are when the silence has done it. Because that's the question that doesn't get asked. Not in the self-help literature, not in the neuroscience papers, not even in most of the philosophical literature on consciousness. They ask what consciousness is made of, what generates it, how it relates to the brain, whether it survives the body. Important questions, every one of them, but they rarely ask the quieter, more personal version. Who are you when you are not being measured? When no role is requiring you to be a particular thing? When no relationship is reflecting a particular version of you back at yourself? When the performance, however genuine, however earned, is temporarily suspended, and what remains is not an absence, but a presence that preceded all of it. That presence has a quality, and the only instrument precise enough to detect it is the silence you've been avoiding. Let's close the loops. We started with a moment, the kind you've had, the kind that arrives uninvited in the gaps between the noise, where something in the quiet turned to look at you, and the recognition was almost unbearable. We asked whether that moment was avoidance or accuracy, whether the instinct to fill the silence was a flaw or a signal. Here is the answer. It was both. And understanding why it was both is the whole point. The instinct to fill the silence is accurate in the sense that silence is doing something. It isn't neutral. It isn't rest. It is, as we've traced from the quantum vacuum to the default mode network, to the microtubules of your neurons, to the accumulated wisdom of every contemplative tradition that ever took stillness seriously. A measurement event. The most precise measurement event available to a human nervous system. What it measures is not your problems, not your unresolved grief or your accumulated regret, or the gap between who you are and who you thought you'd be by now. What it measures is the distance between the collapsed version of yourself, the one the noise has been continuously confirming, and the full superposition of what you actually are beneath that confirmation. That distance is not a deficit. It is the space where the rest of you lives. And here is the synthesis. One sentence because it deserves that compression. Silence is not where you go to rest from the self. It is where you go to remember that the self was always larger than the noise allowed. That's not poetry. That's a description of a measurable structural reality that Pythagoras pointed at, that Bohm formalized, that Penrose and Hameroff located in the biology, that the neuroscience of the default mode network keeps rediscovering every time it looks seriously at what the brain does when the signal drops. The traditions were right. The physics agrees. And your nervous system has been trying to tell you the same thing every time the quiet arrived, and something in you recognized it. Not as absence, but as presence. Not the absence of noise, the presence of signal. Here is the final turn, and it's a simple one. You don't have to go looking for silence. You don't have to build a practice or carve out a retreat or make a dramatic change to the structure of your life. The silence is already arriving. It arrives in the gap between one task ending and the next beginning. It arrives in the moment after a conversation ends and before you pick up your phone. It arrives at 4 in the morning when the house is still and something wakes you for no reason you can name. It's been arriving all along. The only thing that changes is what you do when it comes. Not feeling it is not the same as doing nothing. It is, in the precise sense this entire video has been building toward, the act of allowing yourself to be measured by the only instrument that can reach the part of you that the noise has never been able to touch. Stay in it long enough, not to find an answer, to become accurate enough to hear the question. Because the question, the real one, the one that has been open since the first moment of this video, the one that all the physics and the history and the neuroscience were really circling, was never about silence at all. It was always about you, specifically about the version of you that exists before the measurement, before the roles confirmed you into a particular shape, before the noise told you who you were by telling you what you were needed for, before the decades of competent, serious, genuine living accumulated into an identity so well established that you forgot it was something you had built rather than something you simply were. That version isn't lost. It isn't buried under the damage or waiting on the other side of some transformation you haven't completed yet. It's in the silence. It always was. And the quietest moment of your life, the one that felt like alarm, like exposure, like something turning to look at you from an empty room, that moment wasn't a warning. It was an arrival. If something in this video landed, not as information but as recognition, I'd ask you to do one thing before you move on to the next thing your day requires of you. Not a practice, not a commitment. Just this. The next time the silence arrives, uninvited, slightly uncomfortable, carrying that quality of presence you've been reflexively filling, stay in it for 30 seconds longer than you normally would. Not to achieve anything, not to process anything, just to let the measurement happen. That's it, that's the whole instruction. If you want to go further, if the question of consciousness and silence and what you are beneath the noise feels like a thread worth following, the next video from this channel goes somewhere this one deliberately didn't, into what the Eastern philosophical traditions understood about the observer, that Western neuroscience is only now beginning to formalize. It picks up exactly where this one ends. The link is here. And if this conversation is one you want to continue, leave a comment with the question that's still open for you after watching this, not a reaction. The actual question, the one that's sitting in you right now, in the space between what this video explained and what it couldn't quite reach. That space is the interesting part. It always is. The silence was never empty.